It was the year 2043 when humanity achieved its greatest dream, perfect sleep. The announcement was not made with the fanfare of a moon landing or the grim solemnity of a nuclear treaty. It was delivered, appropriately enough, during the mid-morning lull, 10:17 a.m., Global Coordinated Time, a time slot chosen by behavioral psychologists for its optimal blend of widespread alertness and receptive placidity. A consortium of neurobiologists, Silicon Valley technocrats, and surprisingly efficient international bureaucrats stood before a bank of microphones in a Geneva studio that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. They spoke of a new dawn, not of the sun, but of the human spirit, finally unshackled from the tyrannical, erratic whims of somnolence. They called it the Universal Slumber Protocol. The science, they assured a yawning world, was not merely settled, it was perfected. The method was a triumph of elegant, convergent engineering, the culmination of decades of research flowing from military projects aimed at creating sleepless soldiers and corporate initiatives to maximize worker efficiency. The solution was twofold, offering a choice between biological and technological purity. The primary vector was a subdermal biochip, the Somnus 9, no larger than a grain of sand, applied via a painless, mass-produced hydrogel patch during routine vaccinations or at any participating pharmacy. Once activated, it operated as a master regulator, a tiny lighthouse in the bloodstream. It continuously monitored a sophisticated suite of biomarkers, cortisol spikes, melatonin levels, core body temperature, neural oscillations, and interfaced via a gentle, government-approved satellite network, the HypnosNet, with a global scheduling algorithm that optimized for time zones, seasonal affective patterns, and even local humidity for maximum respiratory efficiency. For the purists, the bio-Luddites, and those with an irrational fear of microchips, there was the Somnogene option. This was a voluntary one-time viral vector gene therapy, a slight, precise modification to the clock gene that regulated circadian rhythms, promising a more organic and self-sustaining alignment with the protocol schedule. It was marketed with serene imagery of sunrises and natural cycles. Few chose it. The chip was easier, reversible in theory, though the process was notoriously bureaucratic, and didn't involve altering one's fundamental genetic blueprint. It was the path of least resistance, and in a world already exhausted by resistance, that was all that mattered. The narrator of our story, looking back from a future of perfect rest, would describe it not as a choice, but as an inevitability, the next logical step in human evolution. The pre-protocol years were portrayed as a kind of global dark age, a time of terrible, universal suffering. The historical documentaries would use grainy, nostalgic footage of the early 21st century, a businessman asleep at his desk, head lolling back, a student blinking furiously at a textbook, paragraphs swimming before unfocused eyes, a new parent staring into the middle distance, a screaming infant a blur in their arms. The voiceover would be grave, sympathetic. They were prisoners in their own bodies, it would intone. Slaves to a biological process they could not master. Billions of hours of productivity lost. Countless moments of joy missed. All for want of a good night's sleep. The economic toll was measured in trillions, but the human cost was incalculable. And so, the world, exhausted by its own exhaustion, battered by the constant, low-grade anxiety of sleep debt, barely paused to read the terms and conditions. It was a covenant of rest, and who could argue against that? It clicked, agree. The Universal Slumber Protocol went live, not with a revolution, but with a collective, relieved sigh. The path to utopia was, as it always is, paved with draconian legislation and profoundly annoying new social norms. The chaotic years immediately preceding the protocol's final implementation, a period now grimly memorialized in history texts as the Great Grogginess, were a masterclass in societal growing pains, a global case study in how to force a paradigm shift upon a species that just wanted 5 more minutes. It began not with chips or genes, but with chemistry. The first skirmish in the war on sleepiness was the Great Caffeine Purge. It started subtly, with public health campaigns featuring hollow-eyed, sympathetic celebrities asking, "Are you really in control?" Soon after, high-octane energy drinks, those neon-colored bastions of desperation, vanished from supermarket shelves. This was met with widespread mourning among students, emergency room doctors, and long-haul truckers, who staged a notoriously sluggish and poorly organized protest that petered out after most of the participants needed a nap. Then came the coffee rationing. Each citizen was allotted a steadily decreasing number of caffeine units per week, tracked by their national health ID and deducted with every purchase. The black market responded with a vicious efficiency that stunned authorities. Illicit espresso shots were dealt from unmarked vans in office park alleys. Java junkies became a tabloid headline, portrayed as dangerous deviants. The war on sleepiness had its first martyrs, a group of accountants in Milwaukee famously arrested for running a sophisticated cold brew brewing operation out of a disused server room. Next came the architectural and auditory reshaping of daily life. Municipal budgets were slashed for things like park maintenance and library funding and reallocated to the installation of circadian harmonization infrastructure. This meant bedtime sirens. At exactly 10:45 p.m. local time, a gentle, pervasive lavender light would begin to pulse from specially modified street lamps, casting the world in a soporific twilight glow. This was accompanied by a soft, omnipresent chime, a sound engineered by a team of acoustic scientists to be soothingly mandatory, a tone that was proven in lab settings to induce a 12% increase in drowsiness and a 30% increase in mild irritation. Curfews, while not legally enforceable, became socially mandatory through a system of peer pressure so intense it bordered on tyranny. To be seen out after 11:15 p.m. was to be marked as a pariah, a delinquent of rest, a threat to the collective well-being. Neighborhood watch groups, once concerned with burglaries, now patrolled for porch lights left on too late. The most surreal development, however, was the bureaucratic one, the creation of the Sleep Consistency Ministries. A sprawling new branch of the civil service, its employees, officially titled slumber sommeliers, but universally known, less kindly, as the Pillow Police, were tasked with the public re-education campaign. They were an army of indefatigably cheerful zealots, going door to door with pamphlets on optimal pillow loft, the 14-degree neck tilt is the state-recommended angle, and the dire spectral dangers of pre-sleep blue light exposure. They held community seminars in musty town halls on the benefits of synchronized dream cycles for social cohesion, using bewilderingly complex flowcharts. Their logo, a tick composed of a crescent moon and a checkmark, became as ubiquitous as it was loathed. They had an answer for everything, a statistic for every doubt, and a deeply unsettling smile for anyone who questioned the coming bliss. The final rollout of the Universal Slumber Protocol itself was a masterstroke of logistical terror, dubbed Operation Sandman. On a designated Slumber Sunday, vaccination centers, post offices, and pop-up clinics erected in football stadiums and decommissioned big-box stores administered the Somnus 9 biochip patch to an estimated 98% of the global population in a meticulously coordinated 48-hour window. The process was streamlined to the point of absurdity. A number was called, an arm was extended, a patch was applied with a cold squirt of gel, and a government-issued cookie was offered as a reward. The remaining 2% were a mix of holdouts in remote areas, a few dedicated anti-chip anarchists holed up in fortified compounds, and people who had simply slept through the entire event and would soon find their lives to be incredibly inconvenient. Then came the moment. At a predetermined global moment, calculated to create a wave of activation that rolled across the planet with the Terminator line, the protocol activated. In living rooms, offices, and public squares, people watched the countdown on their screens. As the clock in each time zone hit the designated second, a soft, synthesized chime played from every enabled device. There was no gran feeling, no sudden shock. Just a slow, inexorable wave of drowsiness that felt entirely natural. Within minutes, city streets were empty. Offices fell silent. The world, quite literally, went to sleep on command. The great grogginess was over. The era of perfect rest had begun. And as the last waking soul slipped under, the only sound was the gentle, satisfied hum of the Hypnosnet satellites, orbiting silently in the void, their work done. For now. The change was immediate and jarring in its uniformity, a seismic shift in the human experience that manifested not in chaos, but in a quiet, pervasive, and deeply unnerving order. The frantic, organic rhythm of life was replaced by a single, global, metronomic tick. The morning commute, once a ragged, staggered affair stretching from the pre-dawn hours of bakers and nurses to the mid-morning stragglers, collapsed into a single, synchronized event. At 6:30 a.m. exactly, in every time zone, the Somnus 9 chips delivered their wake-up signal. It was not a blaring alarm, but a gentle, internal chime, a soft, pharmaceutical-grade neurochemical nudge that bypassed the ears entirely and spoke directly to the brainstem. Hundreds of millions of people sat bolt upright in bed at the exact same global moment, their brains pre-cleared of sleep inertia, their bodies humming with identical, protocol-mandated vigor. The sound of a city waking up, once a beautiful, discordant symphony of slamming doors, competing radio alarms, and shower water running through old pipes, was replaced by a single, silent, physiological event. People moved through their morning routines with a robotic, unthinking efficiency. There was no fumbling for the coffee maker, because there was no coffee. There was no frantic search for keys, because everything was done on a schedule that precluded franticness. Traffic flowed with a hypnotic, terrifying rhythm. The concept of rush hour evaporated. It was just hour. The roads became predictable equations, and for the first time in history, GPS algorithms could provide an exact time of arrival, down to the second. There were no late employees. The concept of hitting the snooze button became an archaic idiom, a phrase children asked their grandparents to explain, like rolling down the window or dialing a phone. The most profound and unexpected consequence, however, was in the realm of dreams. Regulated by the same master algorithm, the Somnus 9 biochips didn't just regulate the length and depth of sleep. They began to gently template the subconscious by emitting standardized delta wave patterns. What began as anecdotal coincidences quickly solidified into a bizarre new social reality. People began to report strikingly similar dream experiences, a phenomenon the newly formed Ministry of Oneirology termed convergent oniric phenomena. It started subtly, awkwardly. A man in a Tokyo office cafeteria would mention offhandedly that he dreamed of walking through a field of tall, silver grass that chimed like glass when the wind blew. His colleague would pause, her chopsticks hovering over her lunch. "I dreamed that last night," she'd say, her voice low with confusion. "Was there a red balloon caught in the grass, tethered with a silver string?" "Yes," he'd exclaim, a strange thrill of connection mixed with unease. It drifted away over mountains that looked like sleeping faces. Breakfast tables, water coolers, and public transit became forums for dream comparison. "Did you have the one with the endless staircase and the whispering statue?" became a common greeting, replacing comments on the weather. A shared cultural lexicon of dreams emerged overnight. There was the Library of Lost Things, where everyone silently browsed shelves for items they couldn't name. There was the station with no clocks, where anxious dreamers waited for a train that never came. Psychologists, initially alarmed, soon published papers in the Journal of Regulatory Somnology praising the development. Shared dreaming, they argued, was the ultimate empathy engine, a forced march into collective unconsciousness. How could you fear or hate your neighbor when you had both spent the night trying to solve the same unsolvable puzzle in a maze of floating rooms, or fleeing the same faceless but oddly polite pursuer? Conflict required difference, and difference was being systematically erased from the human psyche, 8 hours at a time. Productivity did increase, just as the architects had promised. GDP lines on graphs ticked steadily upward, but the anticipated golden age of human achievement, the renaissance of art and science that was supposed to bloom from well-rested minds, failed to materialize. The gains were incremental, mundane, administrative. People were better rested, and thus made fewer clerical errors. They were less irritable in meetings, which were shorter and far less eventful. They completed their tasks with competent, soulless precision. But the frantic, sleep-deprived genius of a programmer solving a critical bug at 3 a.m., the bleary-eyed inspiration of an artist seeing a new shape in the coffee stains, the late-night, rambling conversations that forged lifelong bonds and wild, impractical ideas, these things vanished. The friction was gone. The world became a very well-oiled, very boring machine. No one complained, of course. They were too well-rested to muster the energy for dissent. Apathy, it turned out, was the ultimate side effect. Contentedness, they discovered, is a poor fuel for revolution and a worse one for art. The human spirit, finally free from the tyranny of fatigue, had somehow been freed from its ambition as well. The economic and social aftershocks of the Universal Slumber Protocol were vast, predictable, and utterly, soul-crushingly dull. It was a great normalization, a flattening of the human experience that eradicated not just problems, but entire ecosystems of need and desire. The world didn't end with a bang, but with a shrug, as whole sectors of life were rendered obsolete by the relentless, peaceful tide of adequate rest. The most visible casualty was the night. Nightlife, that vibrant, chaotic, and often messy testament to human exuberance, was the first and most obvious victim. Bars and nightclubs, already struggling under the caffeine bans and social curfews, shuttered en masse. Their closures were not marked with nostalgic last calls or raucous final parties, but with quiet bankruptcy auctions and for lease signs appearing in windows by the light of the lavender street lamps. Why drink? The buzz of alcohol was a poor, fuzzy imitation of the crisp, chemical clarity provided by the Somnus 9 chip. A hangover, that great equalizer and subject of a million shared commiserations, was now a bizarre and antisocial act of self-sabotage, a deviant refusal of state-mandated perfection. The last call for alcohol was replaced by the universal, silent call for sleep. Restaurants that had catered to late-night crowds of revelers and insomniacs desperately reinvented themselves as pre-slumber snackeries, offering chamomile-infused teas, magnesium-rich smoothies, and turkey sandwiches heavy with tryptophan. Cities, once defined by their neon-lit nocturnal pulses, the humming energy of a downtown at midnight, the lonely beauty of an all-night diner, became dark and silent by 11:01 p.m. The stars, long drowned out by light pollution, made a triumphant return to the skies above metropolises, their glory witnessed by almost no one at all. Whole industries collapsed, not in a fiery crash of scandal, but in a quiet, administrative whimper. The mattress and pillow market, once a multi-billion-dollar arena of orthopedic claims, memory foam innovations, and luxury branding, was annihilated. The Ministry of Commerce, in conjunction with the Sleep Consistency Ministries, certified a single, state-approved model, the protocol-compliant rest surface. It was a flat, firm, gray pad of standardized foam on a standardized platform. It was perfectly, scientifically adequate. There was no plush or firm, no pillow top or cooling gel. Your bed was the same as your neighbor's bed, which was the same as the bed of a stranger in a city on the other side of the world. Alarm clock manufacturers, from the cheap plastic radio clock to the elegant, sunrise-simulating smart lamp, went extinct in a single fiscal quarter. The pharmaceutical giants who had peddled Ambien, Lunesta, and a dozen other chemical lullabies saw their stocks evaporate. Their sprawling R&D departments, once dedicated to conquering sleep, were red-asked to developing more efficient vitamins. The coffee industry was now a museum piece. The complex global supply chain of beans, from the mountains of Ethiopia to the plantations of Brazil, was broken and discarded. Former baristas, those priests of the espresso machine, were retrained as sleep hygiene consultants, their knowledge of Arabica and Robusta replaced with pamphlets on sleep posture. The smell of fresh ground coffee, once the signature scent of morning for billions, became a rare, illicit aroma, a memory trigger that caused a confusing pang of loss for something no one could quite articulate missing. The media and cultural landscape flattened into a featureless plain. Newspapers found their once lucrative health and lifestyle sections had nothing to report. Headlines like 5 New Tips for Fighting Fatigue or The Secret to Beating Insomnia were not just irrelevant, they were nonsensical, like articles about spearfighting techniques in the age of the laser sight. Advice columnists were flooded with letters from people whose only problem was a profound, unchanging peace of mind, which they found strangely troubling to write about. My husband and I never argue anymore, and while that sounds lovely, I sometimes miss the passion of our disagreements. Is this normal? The columnists had no answers. Romance novels struggled to create conflict without the reliable trope of the sleep-deprived, grumpy billionaire. Thrillers couldn't plausibly have heroes who never pulled all-nighters. A new, stifling etiquette emerged. Asking, "How did you sleep?" became the ultimate social faux pas, as the answer was always, invariably, and unerringly the same. Perfectly, thank you. It was a greeting without meaning, a question without a question. Conversation became smoother, more polite, and infinitely less interesting. The shared misery of a bad night had been a universal icebreaker, a common ground for human connection. Now, there was only the smooth, unbroken, and lonely plateau of perfection. The struggle was gone, and without it, so too was the camaraderie it fostered. The world hadn't ended, but it had certainly become a much quieter and much duller place. Human nature, even when perfectly rested, abhors a vacuum. A species that had spent millennia defining itself through struggle, passion, and flawed, unpredictable yearning could not be entirely pacified by state-mandated serenity. And so, resistance sprouted in the cracks of the New World Order, though it was pathetically feeble, poorly organized, and ultimately, deeply boring. The era of perfect rest had its dissidents, but they were less like revolutionary firebrands and more like peevish children refusing to eat their vegetables. They called themselves the somnological libertarians in their manifesto, but the world knew them, with a sigh of profound annoyance, as the nap anarchists. A scattered, leaderless movement of individuals who sought to reclaim their bodily autonomy through the most seditious of acts, the unsanctioned nap. Their philosophy was one of radical repose. They believed the 8-hour block was a tyranny of its own, a monolithic structure imposed on the natural, fluid rhythms of the body. Their rebellion was not one of wakefulness, but of alternative sleep. Their methods were furtive and sad. A mid-level accountant would lock his office door at 3:17 p.m., not for an illicit affair, but for a forbidden 17-minute power nap on the floor, using his ergonomic jacket as a pillow. A student would hide in a university library corral, setting a vibrating watch alarm to ensure her 9-minute micro-sleep didn't spill into protocol-sanctioned territory. Their manifesto, scrawled on the back of a discontinued coffee bag and circulated on dark web forums that took minutes to load due to lack of interested traffic, read, "I dream for me. My fatigue is my own. My schedule is my sovereignty." They saw themselves as heroes, the last bastion of free will in a sedated world. They were universally despised. Their colleagues, upon discovering a napper, wouldn't confront them with anger, but with a kind of hygienic horror, as if they'd discovered a colleague defecating in the water cooler. They were reported to HR for creating an unfair rest advantage and disrupting workplace harmony through erratic energy levels. Their families staged interventions, their voices dripping with concerned condescension. "We're just worried about your deviant circadian rhythms, sweetie," a mother would plead. "It's not natural." Getting caught napping carried a stiff social penalty. It was the new public smoking, a vulgar and selfish act. The pillow police would be called, and the offender would be subjected to a mandatory realignment seminar, which was essentially 8 hours of watching a holographic avatar slowly make a perfectly compliant bed in a very comfortable, state-approved chair. Meanwhile, in the darker, dustier corners of the internet, a fringe group of conspiracy theorists, the one demographic the protocol could not eradicate, posited that the shared dreams were not a benign side effect, but the very point of the entire project. They were the onironauts of truth. Their theory was a convoluted masterpiece of paranoia. The Somnus 9 chip wasn't just regulating sleep, it was broadcasting. The standardized dreams, they argued, were a form of passive, subconscious government propaganda. They're brainwashing us in our sleep, they'd whisper on forums populated by 36 users worldwide. The recurring dream of the endless tercas? It's a subliminal trigger for complacency, teaching us to accept endless, monotonous striving. The library of lost things? They're making us comfortable with the loss of our old lives. The image of the floating key in the ceramic bowl, it's a neurolinguistic program for obedience. Their evidence was a series of garbled connections and desperate pattern seeking. They'd point to a minor policy change that happened the day after a widely shared dream about doors closing and claim causation. They'd dissect the dream of the polite pursuer, insisting it was a metaphor for the sleep consistency ministries themselves. Always following, never catching, just ensuring you keep running. Their theories were, in their own way, far more creative and interesting than the reality they opposed. But they fell on deaf ears. Nobody cared. Investigating a conspiracy requires late nights, copious caffeine, a tolerance for rabbit holes, and a feverish passion. All resources that had been legislated, regulated, and conditioned out of existence. The greatest tragedy for the conspiracy theorist is not being persecuted, but being ignored. And so the rebellions fizzled. The nap anarchists, deprived of the energizing power of true injustice, usually just got tired and went back to the schedule. The onironauts of truth, with no one to convert, eventually just started dreaming the same dreams as everyone else, though they'd wake up and angrily insist they detected a sinister subtext nobody else could see. The system did not crush dissent with boots and truncheons. It simply yawned in its face, and the dissent, embarrassed and out of energy, slunk away to bed. The year drew to a close. The data was collated, the metrics analyzed, and the reports generated with flawless, soulless efficiency. The World Health Organization, the United Nations, and the Global Chamber of Commerce issued a joint declaration from a sterile, soundproofed studio in The Hague. 2043 was to be henceforth known as the Year of Balance. It was, by every measurable metric, a resounding, total, and utter success. The world had achieved a state of equilibrium previously thought to be the stuff of utopian fiction. The numbers were irrefutable and they were everywhere, scrolling on news tickers, displayed in government infomercials, and printed on the now meaningless front pages of newspapers. Workplace accidents were down 73%. Medical costs associated with sleep deprivation, from diabetes to heart disease to depression, had evaporated, saving the global economy an estimated $4.2 trillion. Standardized test scores were up, albeit marginally and without any flashes of genius or creative deviation. The bell curve had not just been smoothed, it had been starched and pressed into a flat, straight line. Traffic fatalities became so rare they were headline news. The Global Wellness Index, a new statistic tracking reported contentment, flatlined at a steady 94% approval, a number so consistent it was statistically suspicious. There were no wars. Political scientists and historians debated the cause. Some argued it was the direct result of a planet full of well-rested, rational leaders no longer making impulsive, fatigue-impaired decisions. The more cynical, a dying breed, argued it had less to do with universal rest and more to do with the fact that everyone was now too placid, too unmotivated, and too content to bother with the exhausting, messy business of complex geopolitical maneuvering. Apathy, it turned out, was a more effective peacekeeper than any treaty. The biggest international incident of the year was a polite, days-long disagreement at the UN over the interpretation of a standardized dream featuring an otter with a pocket watch. The Nordic bloc felt its pace was unnecessarily frantic and disruptive to the morning's calm, while the Mediterranean bloc found it a delightful and stimulating start to the day. The resolution was a jointly authored memo agreeing to passively monitor the oniric content for further developments. The world was, in a word, fine. It was perfectly, uniformly, monotonously fine. There were no great tragedies, but also no great triumphs. The thrilling unpredictability of a late night, the desperate struggle against fatigue, the glorious, unexpected surge of a second wind, these were the frictions that had once sparked the fires of creativity, passion, and deep connection. Now, there was only the smooth, frictionless glide into an 8-hour rest, and an equally smooth, uneventful glide through the 16 hours of placid, purposeful, and profoundly empty consciousness. The story ends not with a bang, but with a synchronized global yawn. A state-appointed historian, recording the official account of the Year of Balance for the public archive, would sum it up with solemn, unintended irony. The footage would play of perfectly managed traffic, hushed and efficient workplaces, and families sharing a silent, nutritious meal before their 10:45 p.m. curfew, all smiling the same faint, contented, state-approved smile. The narrator, her voice a model of calm, measured certainty, would solemnly intone the epitaph for an era of human struggle. And so, with 8 perfect hours, humanity finally had nothing left to dream about. The screen would fade not to black, but to a restful, protocol-approved shade of number 010101, a darkness that was efficient, battery-saving, and guaranteed not to stimulate the retina. The HypnosNet satellites continued their silent orbits, their work complete. Humanity had won its longest-held war, and in the utter, complete, and absolute silence of its victory, it finally heard the cost, the quiet and the stillness, and the endless, gentle yawn of forever.